So today we're going to look at anti-pattern patterns. This topic came to me after spending 30-something episodes of the podcast looking through anti-patterns. Covered a different anti-pattern every time. And this was a development-related one, project management-related one, corporate ones, general management, source control, object-oriented, all these different anti-patterns. And after going through so many of them and talking about how people get into them and how to avoid them and how to get out of them, there are a couple of really strong patterns of ways to do things that came out of that. And so I say, you know what, if there's a good way to sort of distill what anti-patterns can teach us, then this would be it. Here's a couple of things that we want to talk about. So that's what this presentation is going to be, is I want to get into that and get those couple of, nuggets of knowledge that I got out of looking at a lot of anti-patterns. And basically it's just, simple quote sort of at the end is because I did a wrap up, and it was, when you start examining a large number of anti-patterns, then actually there's a lot of patterns that emerge. And you see that we tend to do stupid things same way over and over and over again, which is maybe part of why they're anti-patterns in the first place, because we do the same kinds of things. We make the same kinds of mistakes. And so thinking about that, I'm going to jump back and just do sort of a quick review of what is an anti-pattern. And then we'll talk about a couple of common ones. And you may even start seeing some common themes running into those before we get into a couple of 3 points I want to bring out, these patterns within the anti-patterns related to communication, design and planning, and cutting corners. Whoops, wrong way. So first thing, what is an anti-pattern? And I'm just going to go start with just the simple wiki page on Wikipedia type definition of it. Anti-pattern is a common response, quoting, is a common response to a recurring problem that is usually ineffective and risks being highly counterproductive. The term, coined in 1995 by Andrew Koenig, was inspired by a book, Design Patterns, which highlights a number of design patterns in software development that its authors considered to be highly reliable and effective. Which, interestingly enough, there is an anti-pattern that is called design patterns, which basically says that, hey, if you use design patterns too much, then you're probably not being creative enough in your solutions. Nevertheless, we've talked about design patterns a couple of different times. There was a whole season on them in the podcast where we went through all the different design patterns that are out there. It's also known as the Gang of Four book. It's officially Software Patterns of Design, and very useful in software development. And it's now interwoven in everything we do. We talk all the time about things like an MVC and factories and things like that. All of those came out of the Software Patterns book. And so now we have all of these essentially canned solutions that are software patterns. Well, when you think about how we do stuff, there's also a lot of anti-patterns. It's things that we do that we shouldn't. It's how we get ourselves painted into the same corner over and over again. And that's where you have this, common response to a recurring problem where we do it and we either, don't think about it enough, or we don't do it quite the right approach to the solution. And the next thing we know, we're in a situation we don't want to be. And so that's what an anti-pattern is. It's essentially how not to do stuff. And there's a bunch of different anti-pattern types that are out there. If you go look at the Wikipedia site, or if you just do a Google search on anti-patterns, you're going to see all kinds of sites. They're going to have dozens, maybe it's probably a couple hundred by the time you get done. And they cross all kinds of areas. So you have like organizational anti-patterns, for example, bleeding edge, where people are just using technology as an organization it's not proven technology, and they have all kinds of issues with it. Project management, like the world famous Death March, where a Death March would be more pleasant than going through those, where you're just in a project that never seems to end and just drains the life out of everybody as a part of it. Software design, like with anti-patterns like gold plating, where you're sitting there designing your application and you've got all these bells and whistles that absolutely do nothing at the end of the day. You're just trying to make it all shiny and it has really no value. Object-oriented programming anti-patterns, like the God object, where you have your object-oriented, but you basically have one object that does everything, which sort of defeats the purpose. Programming, spaghetti code, which just about everybody has run into and is probably the only Italian-based thing as far as food is concerned that you really don't want to have anything to do with. And if you haven't run into spaghetti code, then God bless you. You've had an incredibly awesome life, because it's everywhere. We normally start out doing it, actually. If you look through the stuff you did probably when you started programming, there's probably a lot of spaghetti code out there. You just sort of slapping code in there, hoping it all works. There is methodological, which is not an easy word to say, but those kinds of anti-pattern types that are out there, like the golden hammer, where you find a tool that you like and you suddenly decide that's what you're going to use everywhere. That thing needs to be used no matter what, whether it's a language or a tool, platform, you name it. And even configuration management has its own series of anti-patterns, including things like dependency hell, where you end up and you can name your dependency type, whatever your library is, whether it's DLLs or JavaScript libraries or Java libraries or C# libraries or whatever it is, where you've got all these different libraries and all these different frameworks you're using, and you've got to match all the versions, and you got to make sure that the right things are used in the right place, and you have to have the paths right so everything gets loaded properly, and thus you're in your own little self-made hell. Again, an anti-pattern. So flying through some common anti-patterns, just sort of hitting some more, and these are with just brief description of each. And I'm sort of going to fly through those a little bit, but on a higher level note. So just there's analysis paralysis, which is basically where you're spending too much time thinking about something and not doing. Bicycle shed, which is essentially where you take trivial stuff and you blow it out of proportion. This is like making a mountain out of a molehill, is that you've got all these trivial little issues and you're working on those instead of bigger issues. For example, it may be that you find yourself lost in deciding exactly what hex code color blue this thing needs to be when the core application itself doesn't even work. Bleeding edge, which I talked about, is where you're trying to find the coolest, latest, neatest thing out there, and it's not proven, and it ends up causing all kinds of problems because it doesn't have the support or it doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Bystander apathy, which is where basically is the idea of if you're just hanging out there, you're not as likely to help things out. So if you don't feel like you're a part of the team, then you're not going to care as much. Cash cow is where you had some success with a product, and you're basically killed by your own success. We look at that too much as the way you need to go, and it immediately kills your creativity and your ability to determine new problems and solutions that you need to build. Design by committee, where you just have too many stinking people, too many cooks in the kitchen, and every decision is argued and hashed through and takes way longer than it needs to. Escalation of commitment, which is basically where you just don't get anybody that wants to admit that you made a mistake, that they basically, you just sort of, it's throwing good money after bad. It's like, well, we made this mistake, but if we work harder or we throw more work at it or more money at it or something, that will make it better, as opposed to just cutting your losses. And then just flying through some more names, that you have abstraction inversion and ambiguous viewpoints and big ball of mud and databases and IPC, gold plating, interplatform effect, input kludge. All of these you may have run into, maybe not. And a lot of them, you'll find out that you probably ran into them at some point. You just maybe didn't know the quote official name, which, funny enough, with anti-patterns, there's official names are a little harder to come by because there's not one source really for all of these anti-patterns that are out there. It's more like things that just have become commonly used. And some of these things that you will have run into in the past, which are old sayings, essentially, like not reinventing the wheel, things like that, which is reinventing the wheel itself. would be an anti-pattern. Or probably even things like, if you think of any saying almost, square peg, round hole. That would actually be, there's probably an anti-pattern out there that's named that because we run into it enough. So that being said, you go through all of these different anti-patterns and all the stuff that's out there. Even if you look at just the shortest definition, a sentence or two definition of each anti-pattern, one of the things that comes out a lot is that communication is not what it should be. So as you look through these anti-patterns out there, for example, a lot of them, particularly in the management, project management, and even design world of anti-patterns, is that the communication across teams is not what it's supposed to be. Either it doesn't exist, or it's not useful enough, that it doesn't have the right level of detail, or maybe the teams aren't essentially speaking the same language. And so that as information goes from team to team, it's not communicated properly. So the knowledge that you're trying to transfer in your communication doesn't occur. In a similar sense, you can run into that in a vertical sense, where maybe management is not talking to the staff properly, or the CEO or whoever's leading, the visionaries of the company are not disseminating that information down. And you see this in larger organizations more often than not, because smaller ones, sort of everybody's together. But as you get larger, there's a lot of cases where you'll have big projects, and the people that are working on them really have no idea why that project's going on. I mean, they may have some vague sense of, we're going into this market, or we're doing this, we have this big directional change that we want to go to, or we want this big customer we want to win, or something like that. But the why behind it, why is it that this problem needs to be solved? Why is it we need to solve this problem in this particular way? If that information doesn't get passed down, then it becomes actually really difficult for people to do their jobs, because all of us as technicians, as implementing solutions, there's always going to be some constraints around the solution that makes one better than another. Whether it's usability or speed or scalability or general quality or reliability and all that kind of stuff, all the itties that are out there, those are the kinds of things that you're going to find the right balance to get the solution that is the best for that specific problem. But if you don't know enough about that problem to make it specific, then there's no way you're going to match a specific enough solution to it. And so whether it's cross-team or vertical, that's where you can start running into problems. And you see this a lot, where you see companies that have people that just, the staff is just going gangbusters. They're generating all kinds of stuff and creating applications, and they're running through releases, and they're like knocking stuff out every sprint and all that kind of stuff. But it seems like they're running in quicksand, because they don't have the guidance. They don't have the direction to really be able to take that effort and focus it in the same direction, or at least in the direction the company wants to go. And you can even get into communication within the team. One of a common thing would be, if you don't really know what the other members of your team are doing and you're all working in the same code base, it's easy to duplicate effort. And think about it, if you have a sprint, you just have a simple Kanban board, and people are pulling the little sticky note off the board for their work. Well, if you have a situation where you don't get to see what other people pulled, if there's just sticky notes there and you're not actually pulling one off, but it's just somebody looks at it and says, I'm going to do items 1, 2, and 3, but there's nothing communicated that says that they're doing 1, 2, and 3. And the next person comes through says, I'm going to do 2, 3, and 4. Now you've got people duplicating effort, and because they're not communicating, you're not going to realize that until it's too late, when both of them try to commit stuff and say, wait a minute, you got your chocolate, my peanut butter, or something like that, where it's like, hey, you just did the same code I was working on. And so now we have all kinds of issues, like maybe merging and stuff like that. And the things we're communicating sometimes are very granular, like what am I working on? What code base am I in? What files am I doing? What part of the problem am I addressing? Which is, plans and to-do lists and things like that. But it's even at a bigger level, we'll find that a lot of the anti-patterns are that goals and visions are not pushed through the team properly. So everybody doesn't understand where they're going. It ends up giving you the situation of not everybody rowing the boat in the same direction because their priorities are not the same. They don't have and may not have enough information to set their priorities properly or to understand where the priorities need to be. That's why you have in sprints, when you look at agile approaches to doing things, you have the idea of epics and stories that are guiding requirements around the actual tasks. So instead of just saying, you need to write this method, it's we need this method because this is the user experience that we're trying to create, and this method gives us this piece of creating that user experience. And that allows you to have some context for what you're doing, because without it, it's easy to get off track. And along with plans, it's reporting progress as well. There's things where you're just not, if you're not giving some sort of feedback on a regular basis, then it's easier for people to get off track. You do these little minor corrections along the way because you realize that you're getting a little off track versus huge corrections or maybe almost impossible corrections to make because you waited too long to get some sort of feedback. And with all of that, there's even back into that communication thing, there's several times that it just has to do with the channels of communication. Maybe the vertical and horizontal, within your team, across teams, within management, there are ways to communicate. There are channels to communicate. But sometimes there's not enough. So you end up with things where there's too many layers of communication. You play like the old phone game where A says something to B, says something to C, says something to D, says something to E. And by the time you get to the end, there's been 3 or 4 levels of translation of some sort that have gone through. And the data, the communication, the content is not what it should be. It's not quite correct because you weren't able to go directly to the source. So sometimes you run into that. It may be that for example, you may have situations, and I've seen this enough, where maybe QA isn't part of the design process and doesn't even talk to the designers or maybe even some of the key stakeholders. So you have a situation where people are trying to test a solution, but they don't really have the context of what the solution is. So then they're sort of hosed. It's basically then they have to have somebody more or less dictate to them what they need to test, which almost defeats the purpose of them being, QA staff, is that they're not able to really utilize their skills properly because they've just had stuff dictated to them. And that's what you get with communication across the board. If you don't do it right, if you don't have enough trust, if you don't have enough information for people to do their jobs, then they're not going to be able to do their jobs. It's sort of common sense at that point. And so communication is a huge issue with anti-patterns. If you have an organization where you are disseminating information properly and people are on the same page, it is amazing how many anti-patterns will just go away. There will be a non-issue because all of the things that lead to that anti-pattern disappear because communication is good. And if those anti-patterns show up, a lot of times the first thing to look at is, are we communicating what we need to the right people at the right time and the right way? Are we giving feedback? Things like that. Number 2, which is maybe almost number 1 in issues with anti-patterns, it falls into like the design and planning area of our lives. And it can start at the big picture, where it's the software development lifecycle, where we're just not doing requirements gathering and design properly. Maybe not at all. I know some places they just sort of like scoot right through that. Maybe they do requirements gathering and then just spend a few minutes on design and then boom, you're off and into the implementation side. Sometimes design is done, but it's not maybe communicated properly, which again goes back to that communication thing. But the design is not to a proper level. So the actual experience, the actual solution has not really been thought about. And then implementation ends up being not quite correct because we didn't really think through deep enough what we needed to think through. So we didn't realize that, oh yeah, there's a whole lot of problems that are, I guess, sub problems of getting to our solution. If we haven't thought through them, then you start running a lot of anti-patterns related to that, where you're essentially scrambling and changing stuff on the fly. And then doing that ends up causing, people to rush through stuff, and then quality drops. And then there's all sorts of anti-patterns that will develop through those. And so with this, it's one of the things that even in our most basic thing that we do, like our day-to-day tasks as a developer or even as a tester or a designer, all those kinds of things, is you don't need to rush right into the implementation side of it. It will help us, all of us, no matter how good or bad we are at our job. We will get better by taking a little time, step back, and think about what it is you're about to do. You don't need to do it forever. You don't have to, that's a different anti-pattern, the whole analysis paralysis. If you spend too much time thinking about it, that's not a good thing. But if you don't spend any time thinking about it, I think it's pretty obvious that's not going to be a good thing. There's that whole long ago, somebody talked about the whole fools rushing in. They may have been talking about software developers at that time. If we rush to implementation, then there's all kinds of issues we can run into. So in order to do things properly, we need to address changes to our approach as they arise, as we run into them. And we have to realize that, if somebody throws a curveball at us, then that doesn't mean we've got to panic and jump right into trying to address that curveball right away. Take a step back, think about it, look at how that curveball that we were throwing actually affects what we were doing, the impact that has, and then adjust accordingly, which may mean changing the initial design, the initial approach that we had. And so this goes to the idea of, even on a small scale, down to the individual working on whatever task they're working on. Think about the task and go through sort of like a mini software development life cycle for it. Is look at what's the requirements for this task. Design even if it's like a pseudocode or something like that, is put together a little approach, some steps to say, okay, this is how I'm going to address this problem. This is how I'm going to get this task completed. And then move into implementing it and verifying it, and then promoting it up or however you do, so that you can ship it or something like that. But that's where a lot of anti-patterns come from, is that instead of us thinking about it a little bit beforehand, giving ourselves some time to sort of think through, how am I going to approach this, we dive right in, and then we run into issues. We make mistakes. We do things that are foolish mistakes, basically, because we probably know better. It's the kind of thing that if we'd really thought about it, we would have done it differently. And this even includes, a lot of times this is where we get changes thrown at us. Instead of stepping back and looking at the overall design, we try to sort of shoehorn that change in, instead of looking at it from a little higher level and thinking about, how does that really need to be designed? If I knew this back when I started my design, how would that impact my approach? And while you can't always go all the way back to the starting point and be able to change everything, at least in thinking about that, you're a little more likely to be able to design that change into your solution properly, or at least have the hooks or whatever you need to say, hey, I know I'm shoehorning this in. I don't have enough. I just can't go. I don't have the resources to go back and totally fix it. But at least it's one of those you get to mark as, hey, we'll come back and fix that later, hoping and praying that you actually do get to deal with that technical debt at some point. And so that's sort of that, that idea of, anytime you get a change, anytime you're stepping anything into a new task or something like that, it's just think about your overall approach. How are we doing this? What is and hopefully all this has been communicated to you properly, is like, what's our goals? What's our priorities? How does this thing need to fit into the big picture? And then how do I make that thing fit into the big picture properly? If I'm thinking about that and not just trying to implement it right away, I'm much more likely to have a happy ending, basically, is not run myself off a cliff and end up in some sort of nasty anti-pattern. And this even includes planning on a project scale. Things like death marches can pop up when you don't think about what's all the work that's going to go into this. Instead of just like setting some random deadline, it's much more effective to get some feedback and understand what's the estimate and the efforts, and how does this in the real world, how fast can we get to the point that we want to get to, so we can plan things out appropriately, instead of just trying to work everybody to death and hope that they don't keel over or quit before we get to our, get across the finish line. Cutting corners is a huge area in all of these. It actually goes back a little bit to that design idea of not spending the time up front. Is instead you just sort of like dive into it, and that is a method of cutting corners for sure. Documentation, probably one of the biggest areas that we run into from the software and development world, because we love to write code, we don't like to document. And so there's a lot of cases where this goes back to, this sort of like dovetails out of communication. If we don't have good comments, if we don't have documentation around our designs and our decisions and things like that, then you're going to run into anti-patterns, because people don't have the background knowledge that they need to be able to work with whatever it is that we create. Quick fixes are the total enemy of software everywhere. I don't know how many times we've run into stuff, and we do it. Doesn't matter how good we are, how long we've been doing it, how experienced we are. Those things come up where the CEO says, "Hey, this thing's on fire. We need to get it fixed," and we go and we fight the fire, and we don't really think about it enough, either in the moment or afterwards. And the next thing you know, we've put ourselves into an anti-pattern. We've slapped a bunch of duct tape and baling wire to this thing, and we start running into issues because we cut corners. We didn't spend the time to really think through this and to address it in an intelligent and methodical way, as we should have. Which again steps right into the idea of like skipping some of the software development steps. If we don't test, if we don't design, if we don't gather requirements, obviously if you don't implement, if you miss some of those things, or you don't do them in a complete fashion, then you're going to run into issues. And we all know that situation. We've all run into those. I think those situations where you get to testing and it was going to take 4 weeks to test the project, and you've got 2, so they just test it for 2 and then they move on. You didn't complete it, and so you're probably going to run into problems. If there's part of your work that you don't do, it's going to run into problems. And we see this as developers, and we can point to a lot of different areas. But as developers, we do this a lot, where we don't commit our code on a regular enough basis. We don't put comments into our commits enough. So we look at stuff, and it's just like, commit after commit after commit that says like, change some code, updated some little thing. Nothing that really tells you what was in that commit. We have all these tools, we have all these best practices. If we don't follow them, we're cutting corners. And then it's amazing how many anti-patterns we can stumble into doing that. Now, there's no guarantee that we're going to run into them, but the odds increase dramatically. Code reviews are a perfect example. I think all of us know that we get a good deal. Any code review that's done right, we're going to get something out of it, both as a reviewer and as the reviewee. The reviewers understand the code better. You get cross-functional knowledge, get all of that kind of good stuff. The people that do it, the reviewees, their code was reviewed, they get a second set of eyes. They may get a cleaner solution. They may get a recommendation of an easier way to do it. They may learn something about the problem that somebody else has got a different experience, and they share some stuff about it. And the next thing you know, your team as a whole is getting better. You're dragging everybody along, and that whole idea of the rising water raises all boats kind of thing. But it's easy to skip those, or to just like check them off. You cut a corner on a code review, so you just like look at the 5 file names that changed, and that's it. You don't actually really spend enough time looking at the code or the context of that code to be able to ask the kind of questions to say, okay, why did you take this approach? Whether maybe it doesn't look right, or maybe it's just sort of I don't know that I would have done that, so why did you do that? Those kinds of questions, really are going to bring true value to code review, as opposed to just sort of like, hey, I looked at your code, I saw that you changed 5 files. Okay, check off and move on to the next one. And of course, the struggle we have with a lot of these cutting corners, that we end up we're working to a deadline instead of creating a quality product. Now, there is something to be said, as we've talked about, for spending too much time trying to make things perfect instead of saying, okay, it's the Fisher cut bait syndrome. It's basically, you get to a point where you say, all right, this really is functionally where it needs to be. We're spending way too much time getting those last little bits of pieces, and we're building a higher level quality product than we need to. That's understood, that can occur. But more often than not, that's sometimes our problem, but more likely the problem is going to be that we're cutting quality to try to get something out the door, that we're not walking through all the steps, crossing all the T's, dotting all the I's as we should, as we know, because of best practices to do. We're not doing them. And then we end up having something that gets out, quote, on time, but maybe it's not what it needs to be. Or you rush it out the door, and the next thing you know, you're spending weeks in this cycle of doing these hot fixes and trying to correct all these old bugs that you introduced because you cut one too many corners. So I just had really 3 primary areas of us to think about to avoid anti-patterns. But the interesting thing is that these affect a huge number of anti-patterns. So it's like, if you can nail those 3 things, if you can properly communicate stuff, if you spend your time in design, and you just don't cut corners, like 60% or maybe more like 80 to 90% of the anti-patterns, you're not going to hit. Because the whole problem with those anti-patterns, it goes back to, you didn't do one of those 3 things, or maybe multiple of those things correctly. So just a few steps. It's any language, any environment, however you do it. A few of these steps can help you avoid most of the anti-patterns. And amazingly enough, you'll find that if you look at best practices in software development, that's exactly what they do. Is they're emphasizing proper communication, they're emphasizing design, and they're emphasizing not cutting corners. Even Agile, for being anti-documentation in so many people's minds, is not really short-circuiting anything like that. It's not cutting corners. It's saying, it's really focusing on putting the right amount of effort into each of those steps, but still following each of those steps. I know people have bastardized it and pulled out certain pieces and said, oh, we really don't need this, and we really don't need that, and we can do this thing and get around this thing that we don't like. But that's not what it is. If you really look at it, then if you look at teams that do Agile development properly, they're still going through all of those steps. They're still covering all of those pieces. They're just doing it in the what in a lot of cases the most efficient way. They're trying to cut down all of the extra fluff around these tasks and distill it down to, these are the tasks we need to do, and we need to make sure that we do them completely and correctly, and then move on. And we don't want to put any more effort into each step other than what we need to. So it's not rocket science. This is something you can just like dive right into. You can see it in your organization. You can see it in your team. You can see it in how you personally address your work. If you have these things as some markers or some things that you want to check off as like, I want to make sure I'm doing these right, you can jump into those right away. And if you have this as a consideration, then over time, when you make mistakes, when you don't do these things properly, then you can learn and say, oh, I didn't do this quite right. And so you adjust and you move forward. The simplest thing that I've seen this with a lot of people and work with a lot of people is just reporting status to your boss or your customer. Is everybody starts out and you do something very simple. You can find all kinds of templates and you'll report information. And at some point, you may realize either that your boss is complaining because you give too much information, or you realize that you had not shared the right level of information, and so you adjust. You learn from your mistakes. Say, okay, that wasn't exactly the right way or maybe the best way to do it, so I'm going to make some adjustments and I'm going to move forward, and you keep going. It's not that hard to do, and it's just sort of it's one of those things. It's a good way that you can get better every day or every week. And it does go back to the whole idea of, through all of this, we're talking about anti-patterns. Best practices are there for a reason. There are a lot of people that have done a lot of work in whatever that area is, and they've learned that these are the things that we should do, or these are the things that we should avoid. And so when you can find those, it is very useful to at least understand them and probably embrace them in a lot of cases. I mean, there are situations where the best practices are probably more than you need to do. It's, building the Cadillac instead of the little Yugo, but it's still good to know that they're out there so that you can turn those best practices into maybe some best habits for yourself, both personally, for your team, for your organization. And that being said, I think we're at a good point here to open this up for questions or comments.
Yeah, Rob. So I was listening and I started thinking about like prototyping solutions. That's not typically part of, I guess when I'm talking about like team development, and you don't see a lot of prototyping so much as you see the requirements and then, the building or some type of design and then just implementing that design. Have you seen any situations or instances in which prototyping the solution can get you around some of the problems that you see with the anti-patterns arising in the team solutions or whatever, just where prototyping can assist in this?
Definitely, because prototyping is in itself a design exercise. So the idea of prototyping or proof of concepts I find to be an excellent way to sort of step into some of these, I guess, some of the design side of it. Now you can still, it's like everything. It's not a silver bullet, so you can still screw that up. You can prototype or demo or proof of concept yourself into a pretty bad situation where you take code that sounds worse than it is, but you sort of slap together to try to get it to get a solution. And if you build off of that too much, then there may be some things that you missed. But even in doing a proof of concept, there still should be, it will help you to take some time before you even dive into implementing the proof of concept, right, to think through, what is it you're trying to solve? What's the problem I'm trying to solve? What are the steps I need to take to get to the solution? So that when you get into building, that demo, that prototype, that you've still, you've instilled in that some design time and some forethought and things of that nature. I mean, you can get in and sort of it's basically, designed by implementation, where you're just like getting in there and you're starting to, futz around with your initial code and you're sort of thinking through it on the fly. But I think that's not as effective. And it could still lead to some of these anti-patterns where it's a little better if you step back first and say, okay, I'm going to think about what I'm going to do and then do it, as opposed to I'm going to do it and be thinking while I'm doing. Does that sort of make sense and answer your question?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Other questions and comments?
Yeah, I got a quick. Can you elaborate more on the spaghetti anti-pattern, and how hard is it to change if you're a developer who used to developing that way? And I would assume like a person who does that will be like an entry-level developer. Or
spaghetti code is definitely a design-related anti-pattern. If you spend time beforehand, and that's why a lot of schools and a lot of courses in that around development start you out doing things like creating flows and using pseudocode and things of that nature, is by getting you to spend a little time beforehand, think about what it is you're doing, and sort of create yourself an outline for how that code should look, how that code should be implemented. When you do that, you spend that time on that kind of a design, you're less likely to have spaghetti code, because it's spaghetti code almost by itself. It shows it's like stream of consciousness coding. It's where you're just writing code and you're starting to change stuff and you're just sort of tweaking stuff as you go, as opposed to thinking about it and then laying out a solution and then working within that framework or outline that you created as part of building a solution. If you think about having a little flow diagram for how the solution is supposed to work, if you've started with that, then your code at least is going to follow that flow. You're going to have, if you think of the steps and the boxes as part of your diagram, you're going to those are going to translate into the code that you write. You're going to somehow be able to see, probably, I think it'd be very hard not to see where the boxes in the flow that you diagrammed are in that code, which you can point the lines of code and say, well, here's where I'm doing this step. Here's where this, flow from point A to point B. This is how I'm getting to that point. Here's where I get to point B and the things that I'm doing at point B. That design, that time that you took, is going to help you avoid spaghetti code. And if you think about it as spaghetti code as you solving a problem on the fly while you're in the code, then I think that's where it really helps you see that if you take a second, instead you design it, even if you're within code, even if you're maintaining code, you're adjusting some broken code or some insufficient code to cover a new feature or a new function or fix a bug that occurred. If you're thinking outside of the code a little bit, if you're writing something down or giving yourself sort of a plan of attack and designing your solution, then you'll see that spaghetti code is going to go away. That's not going to be an issue. And anybody else that's coded, if you've got any other hints on that, definitely feel free to add to that comment.
That sounds about right.
Cool. Any other questions, comments? All right. So what have we learned today? What have we talked about? Well, there are a ton of anti-patterns. I highly recommend, if you ever want to somewhat entertain and maybe scare yourself a little bit, is go out and do a Google search on anti-patterns and look at what's out there, because a lot of them have a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek approach to how they describe things. Although they're very serious and very painful, they try to find a way to put a little bit of laughter into these painful things that we run into. But I think just knowing that some are out there and just reading about them, even just spending a few minutes and learning that what's out there, is very valuable, because it puts some of these things in the back of our mind as potential anti-patterns that we could run into. And I guess it's that whole, was that G.I. Joe or whatever, where they said knowing is half the battle. Well, it's probably more than that. If you know that these anti-patterns are out there, if you know that there's some things that we are generally, as just people, prone to do, then I think it helps us avoid them a little bit, because it helps us maybe have a little bit of that in the back of our mind. So if we step into one of those anti-patterns, we're a little more likely to say, whoa, wait a minute, this feels like something I shouldn't be doing. And with that, the idea that standards and consistency, best practices, those kinds of things are key. If we follow these three pieces, then these three recommendations, then it's going to help us. And that's the whole idea of anti-patterns, is they're there to point us, give us some warning signs of places we shouldn't go. And so, that the things that we learned are, we need to communicate. We need to communicate properly and make sure that we can communicate to the people that we need to, that the channels are open as they need to be, so that we not over communicate, not under communicate, but find that the the happy middle of the Goldilocks and the three bears there or whatever. Is find the level of communication that's just right for the information that we're trying to disseminate. We got to design. We got to spend some time thinking about it. Our jobs are problem solving. We've talked about that so many times, but key to solving problems is thinking and designing the solution. It's like a solution that is basically just randomly running through options is not very good. Think about if you've got a combination lock that you're trying to solve. Yes, you can get to a solution by just, if you know that it's 4 digits and you just start going 1111, 1112, 1113, 1114. I mean, you can do brute force, but that's not really a solution. That's just brute force. That's just like beating down the problem. So instead, we want to, our goal is to solve problems, but really, I guess the 1A and the 1B part of it is to provide an elegant, preferably, solution to the problem, not just solving the problem, because we're going to have to solve the problem usually more than once. That's the whole point of what we're doing, is to automate solutions. And so the more we understand, the more we think through, the more we design, the better our solution is going to be. And then follow through. We know what we need to do. We spend time. We've been educated somewhere along the way on how do we do this? What are some of the best practices? And we get into industries, and there's magazines and speakers and all kinds of stuff that tell us these are some of the things that we need to do. And we know, because we've done this, these are the steps we have to take. This is the approach that we have to take to get to a solution, to do things properly, to do it the right way. And so, yes, we're going to have pressures sometimes to cut some corners or to skip some steps here and there, but we need to be strong enough and confident enough to push back a little bit and say, okay, this is how this needs to be done. So, unless you're willing to accept lower quality, this is the better approach to take. And if you are willing to accept lower quality, then we need to make sure that we don't do that on a regular basis. Otherwise, suddenly anti-patterns are going to emerge all over the place, and we are not going to be very happy about it. And as we reach the end of yet another presentation, as always, appreciate the time, the feedback, the Q&A. If there's any other questions, anything that comes up in your mind, you can always reach us in 1,000 different ways, whether it's email to info@developernoor.com, the contact us form out at Developernoor site, at Developernoor on Twitter, where we're regularly throwing information out there, and more than happy for anybody to send any responses that way, or even the old school Facebook site. We've got the Developernoor site page out there as well. And we're just going to keep trying to make every developer better, and ourselves included, as we go through this journey. So go out, have a good day.